Namaskar ji to everybody, all the family of the Indus University. I'd just like to thank you for taking the opportunity to give me a platform to talk about this issue. But also, I'd like to thank those who have taken some time out of a weekend, which could be spent in much more pleasant activities with family and friends, as far as is possible, and have devoted that time to talk and listen about this issue to do with caste. Now, caste is a strange sort of a subject for somebody like myself to have spent so much time researching it. So before we go into the caste bomb itself as a concept, I'd just like to take a little bit of time to run the tape backwards as to why it is that I wrote the book, why I had to write the book, and indeed why it was necessary at this time. So if I wind the clock back, here in the United Kingdom, some 5 years ago now, just towards the beginning of 2016, the British Hindu community were attacked by a libel, by an attempt to vilify, demean, to undermine us, and to cause friction within our community. And it was not done by some fringe outfit. It was not done by some extremist group. It was done in the House of Lords. And it was launched by a very respected member of the Church of England, a senior bishop, Lord Harries of Pentrigarth. This is where it first came to my attention. So if you can imagine, here in the United Kingdom, somebody like myself, a little bit of an IT person doing some IT consultancy, but in my seva, I was working with mandirs and with our Hindu community. And also I'm a yogacharya, so I was working with people on how to become healthier and more tranquil and a little bit more focused in their sense of being and how they live their lives. Nice and quiet, no great ambitions or aspirations to ever write a book. In fact, my personal philosophy was that the earth has never been burdened with so many books as it is at this moment in time. And the last thing I wanted to do was to add to that burden. And I'm also very comfortable with the idea that anybody who studies our Shastra and is fortunate enough to be able to go beneath the surface of either the Vedas or our Upanishads, the Vedanta literature, there's nothing else that needs to be written if you want to have the focus on reducing human suffering. So I never wanted to write a book. I felt there was no need to write this book. But what was done was that an unsolicited and wholly undeserved attack was launched against our community. Now, this attack took the form of a speech in the House of Lords, and I will refer to it and share a little bit of it in due course. But at the end of that speech and that debate, the reputation of the Hindu community lay in tatters. We've had 3 generations of investment into this country. Our community have worked here, we have served here, we have paid taxes here, we have become a significant part of the health environment, the educational environment, the finance sector. We are contributing in each and every space, and we have a very enviable reputation. We are known as being tranquil, passive people. We are known as being people who do not have this smallness of identity politics. We are known wherever we go in the world as a community who help towards building a civilization. We are civilization builders. We do not deconstruct or destroy civilizations, and we certainly don't create friction within civilizations. That reputation at the end of this debate in the House of Lords lay in tatters. We had been vilified and demeaned. We had been accused of an allegation that 1 in 2 of our community was a supremacist who was discriminating on a religious basis against other members of the Hindu community. Allegations were made that there were almost 500,000 members of the Dalit community in the United Kingdom who were discriminated against on a daily basis by the rest of the Hindu community. Evidence was produced. And it wasn't just Lord Harries, he led the charge, but there were there were speeches made by other members, including people who are from a Hindu background, who relied on poor quality research, nothing other than colonial tropes, and probably one of the ideology established by one of the most pernicious missionary institutions that the world has ever seen. And at the end of it, each and every person had expressed in the most dramatic manner, they had expressed that the Hindu community definitely and desperately needed intervention by non-Hindus in order to prevent these horrific atrocities which are occurring on a daily basis. So as you can imagine, somebody in my position who's been working with mandirs up and down the country, I scratched my head and I thought, this is not the Hindu community that I work with. I've worked with over 40 temples on a very close basis, and I interacted with almost 300 Hindu institutions up and down the country, and never once had we had anybody come and make an allegation that they had been discriminated against on the basis of this thing called caste. And so where did this evidence come from? And somebody who was genuine in resolving a problem, if there are two parties and there is a difference and an issue between them, a genuine person seeking a resolution will try and create a forum in which both parties could have this conversation. You would at least approach the party against whom the allegations were being made and say, look, we have this problem. Can we sort this out? None of that was done. And I think that's probably something I'd like to share in the first instance for people to make a note of, in that in every one of these instances where caste discrimination is being alleged, you will find that there has been no attempt at mediation, there has been no attempt at resolution, there has been no attempt at two communities coming together to work this out for themselves. What there is an immediate rush to launch a PR exercise, to launch a legislative exercise, which assumes that Hindus are caste supremacists by nature. That is one thing that I noticed. The other thing that I noticed was that we in the United Kingdom had not been consulted at this by this group at all. This group who was suggesting legislation was needed in order to help the Hindu community. Remarkably, they had not taken the first step, which is actually to consult the Hindu community and say, can we work with you? Can we have some data? None of that had happened. Straight away, a speech was made in the House of Lords. And if I can share with you the nature of the speech, let me see if my technology will serve you. If I go, right, so if this doesn't work, could somebody just please indicate with a wave of their hand and say, Satish, it's not quite as it should be. But I'm hoping that you'll be able to see a screen now. And this is a YouTube screen. The video, we'll share the links in due course. But this is what first brought my attention to this particular issue. This is Lord Harries speaking in the House of Lords. And remember, Lord Harries is a former bishop of Oxford. He's an acknowledged academic. He was educated at Cambridge and the University of London. And so when he makes a presentation, you know, one really does have, shall we say, an instinct to say that the data should be good and we can rely on what this person is actually saying. But here's what he actually said.
The Dalit community in this country, of whom there are about 480,000, have been concerned for some time about the discrimination against them.
So this is how it started. And you can see that straight away an allegation has been made, a presumption has been presented, and then data is presented in the form of a report. Now, the report itself was produced on a budget, a minuscule budget, and the report was used to support the demand for legislation. Now, when we contacted the authors of the report, they were horrified. They said, no, the report was not meant to be ever used to support legislation. It was purely anecdotal. We didn't conduct research in the manner in which research on such a sensitive issue would be conducted. We were given a tiny budget. Somebody said to us, what do you think? We went and asked a few questions and we produced this report. And that was the report that was being relied upon by every member of the House of Lords. And they started at 480,000. There were people then talking about 400,000. it was presented as though outside of the House of Lords, there were almost 500,000 people saying, we are being discriminated against by these terrible Hindus. Please, can we have some assistance and support? At the end of it, the House of Lords passed a resolution to include the word caste into equity legislation. Now, as I said, we had checked this out and we were horrified that this was being presented. And when we then started to engage with individual members of the House of Lords, it came back to one thing time and time again. None of them had actually engaged in any consultation. They had done no research. All that had happened is they'd been presented with this information in an emotional manner. And you know how emotions can be wielded by skillful orators, so much so that the people then decide they don't even need to know the facts. They don't need to know the data. They assume that the credibility of the figure of authority that's saying it will have done that checking. And so this is the manner in which the House of Lords was manipulated. In the United Kingdom, legislation is passed by two houses. There's the upper chamber, the House of Lords, and then the lower chamber, the House of Commons. Now, when I heard that this had happened, we then consulted the House of Commons, the parliamentarians, and we said, we want the data. Here's the impact of it. This is terrible. This has been vilifying our community, etc. Now, the House of Commons, the MPs there, the elected representatives, they listened to everything we shared with them and they rejected the amendment. And so it bounced up and down around the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But eventually, even in the House of Commons, it was passed as a piece of political horse trading. It was passed late at one night, otherwise a whole bill would have been scuppered. And the government then did a remarkable thing. What the British government did is they said, look, we're sorry to the Hindu community that this was passed. What we will do is we will not enact it. This has never happened in history. If the upper chamber and the lower chamber pass a piece of legislation, it's always enacted. But in this case, we presented facts to the House of Commons and to the government. And so the government didn't include this particular clause in Her Majesty's speech, which is when a piece of legislation becomes enacted. They gave us the time and they gave us a formal consultation. And at the end of that consultation process, which ran for 9 months, the data that was collected, it established without doubt that this was not a problem in this country. But just imagine what the scenario identified for us. It identified for us that a community that has been investing into this country for the best part of 3 generations, we're 2% of the population, we contribute in the region of 6% of GDP, we have the lowest in terms of Hindus in prison. I think we are, if not the lowest, we are the second lowest. We are our bottom line on the balance sheet of social contribution is very, very profitable. And yet, as a whole community, we had just been on the receiving end of incredible discrimination. The remarkable thing is that the name of equality was used in order to discriminate against us and to deny us our rights to have an equal treatment. So just to think about that, what this caste allegation does is it introduces an understanding that a Hindu can be born and by birth and by culture is brought up to be discriminatory, to be a supremacist. Now that is the height of prejudice. This is the manner in which something called a trope works. And this is something I've described at length in the book. A trope is an idea that can be planted and people accept it as truth without ever investigating the data that's behind it. And tropes have been used as very effective weapons of mass diminution, weapons of mass destruction of reputation, but generally by religious institutions and expansionist cultures to vilify the other in the sense of wanting to denigrate and establish a power imbalance. So if I can share a few tropes, we've had the most draconian one, which most people have heard of, would be the blood libel allegation against the Jewish community. for many, many years, decades, if not centuries, they were libeled. A trope was leveled against them that they were responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. And there is no evidence that this was supported by historical fact or record or anything like that. But the bigger issue is that even if a Jewish person had been responsible for it, it's an act of incredible inequality to be able to leverage an accusation for generations and generations and hold people responsible for something of which they have had no part. It flies in the face of equality legislation and the principles of human rights. And yet, here we had exactly the same principle applied to us. The notion that Hindus, and especially the terrible, terrible Brahmins who have always been vilified by missionaries, that they were instinctively and by birth potentially guilty of discrimination against non-Brahmins, against everybody else. And of course, what that does is it places in a position of power the person whose victimhood has now been weaponized and used against the majority or the larger group, the other. And so this is what was done to the British Hindu community. It was a shock for us. Now, in order to challenge this legislation, I recognized straight away that if this legislation went onto the books, then what it would do is it would enshrine in law a prejudice. Now, none of the other characteristics which are governed and dictate equality legislation are social structures, concepts. They're all attributes beyond our control, such as one's gender, such as one's ethnicity, race, etc., etc. But to say that a person belongs to a caste automatically by birth, and that caste has a horrific history, and therefore that person should be subjected to special provisions in law, it flies in the face of every concept of equality. It would deny the children of non-Dalits the opportunity of being treated as equals in front of the law. Can you just imagine that this piece of legislation passed in the upper chamber and it passed in the lower chamber, and it became part of legislation. The clause was introduced and not enacted. And none of the people who are tasked with scrutinizing every aspect and dimension of legislation to ensure that inequalities don't creep in, that bad law doesn't become a part of legislation, not a single one of them objected to the premise at the heart of this legislation, that somehow Hindus were incapable of being equal. It also, to my mind, it would have cemented in law a lie. One of the biggest lies that came out of the period of colonialism was that to be born a Hindu meant you were born in a caste. This is foundational in terms of the account that the Christianists proliferated around the world about the Hindu society. If I can just define that term, one thing that we are having to do is we are having to create the vocabulary with which to engage with the colonial period in Bharat, in India, because that vocabulary doesn't exist. And in order to avoid the pitfalls that are associated with identity politics, we need to be quite clear on what we mean when we use language. So I use the term Christianist there, and Christianist is the cousin brother of the, shall we say, the Islamist, a person who is willing to use illegal means and violent means to proliferate their ideology and to deny others human rights equality. And Christianists, I'm afraid, do exist. And not only do they exist, they have been very successful in erasing indigenous civilizations throughout the globe. So when I speak about the participation of the Church of Empire in this, I'm referring specifically to the activities of the Christianists. So once I understood that there was a miscarriage of justice here, a miscarriage of justice that was so severe that it would undermine our children in this country and in other European countries, which is where this domino would have had a knock-on impact, it would deny our children the right to have equality in front of the law. Now, once I understood that this was the threat, I really needed to satisfy myself on every front. One, about the history of this issue. Where did it come from? It flies totally in the face of every Adhyatmic Shastra that we have. It flies in the face of the teachings of all of the paramparas which are associated with our Sanatan Dharma. It flies in the face of every instinct that a decent human being has, who understands that Atma is our common identity, and that every other identity, whether it's physical, whether it's intellectual or emotional, is a covering. It's a garment that we wear in order to interact and for society to flourish. So this concept of caste flew in the face of everything that I had known about Sanatan Dharma. So I needed to understand where it came from. And this is where my research really started. Not only did I need it for my own satisfaction to understand it, but in order to help the parliamentarians to understand it, we needed to be able to articulate and provide them with facts and with records which would withstand scrutiny, the highest scrutiny possible. You know, it's ironical that the legislation was passed with virtually no scrutiny, but in order to reverse the impact of that legislation, have it removed, we would have to provide data and records which were capable of being scrutinized and which would withstand the highest level of scrutiny, political and legislative. And that's what I've really contained in this book. This book is the outcome of the research that I did. There are records here in the United Kingdom which are available to us of colonial times. There are records which are available in Hansard, there are records available in libraries, and perhaps it's not common knowledge, but when the British were ejected from Bharat in 47, a huge burning exercise was conducted up and down the country, and records were burned in every center of administration. Many records, though, were loaded onto a ship, and they were sent back to the United Kingdom. And they make a very interesting read in terms of the archives. But I went into archives and established a number of things. The first thing that I've established is that the project to create this identity of caste, to proliferate it and to leverage it, that project, its genesis was the 4th of January 1844. Now I'm presenting that almost as a challenge. If somebody were to visualize this as me tossing down the gauntlet, I am tossing down the gauntlet and saying that the caste concept was created, it was established and first deployed on the 4th of January 1844. On that date, there was a conference of Christianist organizations, of missionary organizations, who wanted to work out how to deconstruct and break apart the fabric of Indian society, so much so that they would then have a vulnerable community at their feet, one that they could then convert and whose souls could then be saved. That was the date upon which this conference took place, and I have access to the records of that. So the first thing I established was the discussions where they conflated Jati with caste and caste with Varna. That link is absolutely important. It's at the heart of this caste trope, that Jatis, the integrity of Jatis, is a threat to conversion. In fact, one of the participants in that conference actually said that caste is the one impediment betwixt the heathen and Christ. Now, when he referred to caste in the same speech, he describes what we call Jatis. So in 1844, the word caste meant Jati, and the integrity of Jatis had to be destroyed so that then, as the community fell apart, they could be harvested and brought into the subservient fold of the Church of England. The second part of that little linkage is the connection between caste and Varna. If you are going to vilify and demean a religious tradition, you've already identified that caste and Jati are co-connected. You now need to bring the third of the unholy trinity into this concept, and the third part is Varna. Because Varna is referred to in scripture, if you can create the trope that caste is an abhorrent thing, and it's found in Hindu scripture, then you have the moral high ground. Not only do you have the moral high ground and you can preach it to your minions and your servants to go forth and to convert, but more importantly, you have the moral high ground to come back to your own source nations and tell the population there that there's this terrible thing in the Hindu tradition called caste, and we have to save the Hindus. And so please give us lots of money so we can do this. So it is a fraud. It's an intellectual, emotional, social, civilizational fraud perpetrated in two directions. It's a violence on the civilization which is being targeted, but it's an intellectual and a fraudulent act of violence against, in fact, the British Christian community as well, who didn't know this. And even to this day, I would share with you, and I include that letter in the book, a very dear friend of mine who is a wonderful Christian, devoted to the word and the principles attributed to the Jesus Christ. And he was horrified when we presented the data to him. He said, I never knew this. Ever since I became interested in the religious activities and the religious life of my nation, I was always told that caste was a systemic, endemic part of the Hindu tradition, and that it's a terrible thing and that we were saving them. But having read the data, he asked forgiveness on behalf of his religious tradition. And I include that letter in the book. So we have work to do. We have work to undo. We have to undo this trope which has been placed around the neck of every child and every Hindu for the last 250 years. This is something, it's no less pernicious than the hateful blood libel which was leveraged against the Jewish community. It's as acidic and as corrosive of community cohesion. And to be perfectly honest, I would go as far as to say that a person cannot claim to be a follower of Jesus Christ and the principles which are attributed to Jesus Christ, whilst permitting such an act of multi-generational violence to continue. In fact, they have a responsibility to join in the atonement and to participate in healing this wound and making some sort of reparation so that our civilization can continue. Now, I put the date out there, 4th of January, 1844. And as I said, it's like tossing down the gauntlet, which is exactly what I've intended to do. Remember, for the best part of 200 years now, we have had this ridiculous, completely fictional Aryan Invasion Theory, universally accepted, and yet it's complete and utter tripe. There is absolutely no academic who is worth their salt who would look at the data, who would look at the process, who would look at the methodology and say that, yes, this is a valid proposition. And yet it's so widely accepted. It's a trope. The Aryan Invasion Theory was a trope. And this is also a trope. Now, we have to engage with this issue. One of the reasons I wrote this book was that when I presented the evidence to the Church of England, I had meetings with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the senior academics and the scholars, and I presented my findings to them, and I laid the accusation at their door that what they had done, it was an existential threat to the tranquility and peace of the British Hindu community. These are the words I used with them. And when they studied the contents that I'd placed in front of them, they too understood that a mistake had been made, and they wanted to participate in the process of undoing the harm that Lord Harries, Bishop of Pentrgarth, had actually initiated. Now, I say that we also found, in fact, information that they were being less than honest with us, in that behind the scenes, they were as committed to the caste trope because it served their evangelical purposes. But this is a part of the psychology and the nature of the Church of Empire, and that we will deal with. But one thing that I found to be really beneficial is those young Hindu members of our Hindu community, after they had read the book, the feedback that I got, it made my mind, it made me content that actually the objective I had hoped to achieve had been partly achieved. One of the youngsters who heads a youth group in a Hindu youth group, he came back and he said, whenever I engage in any interfaith environment, I feel a little vulnerable because I know somebody is going to mention caste. And whenever they do, we feel guilty. And he said, now that I've read the book, I feel I can go into an interfaith environment with my head held high, my spine erect, knowing that if anybody tosses this accusation against me, then I can meet it and I can defeat it. Now, I refer to it as the caste bomb, and let me show you how the caste bomb works, okay? Because it's a weapon, it has an intent, and it has a very particular means of deployment, a distribution mechanism. So let me, by example, share with you another little video recording. So on occasion, I speak on public platforms on behalf of the Hindu community and the Hindu philosophy. And so I'd been invited to participate in a debate for the BBC. And they have a flagship program called The Big Question. And it's broadcast on a Sunday morning. And in this Big Questions program, they have debates and they discuss all sorts of interesting subjects. Now, on this particular day, the debate was, did man create God or God create man? And they had members of the Hindu community. I was there as the Hindu community representative, and they had members of the various other faith traditions, as they call them. And so the conversation started, and here's what happened. Now, see if you can identify why I call this the caste bomb.
A representative of the oldest existing religion on earth. No, it's not you, Abdullah. It is our Hindu representative, Satish Sharma, General Secretary of the National Council of Hindu Temples, oldest existing religion. So when Hinduism first emerged, would it have been by revelation, by intuition? I mean, you know how?
It's been difficult to sit here, but it's always good fun to see our adolescents at play. I would just share that the lens through which all of this discussion has happened so far.
What about the question I just asked you? Never mind lenses.
Never mind lenses.
Okay,
very straightforward.
Yeah.
We have a tradition which says that mystics are always followed by miscreants. And so far in the discussions that we haven't really touched on the notion of a mystical experience. In our earliest records, there are records which are recorded by mystics. And in terms of our time frame, we go back a little bit further than that. And we celebrated 5,154 years of the articulation of one of our core central texts, because there are astronomical references within it which help us to define time frames. So we work on a different cosmology and a different time frame. But this notion that mystics are always followed by miscreants is very, very valuable. There is an established tradition. We have thousands of books, and they're all the records of people who have engaged in some sort of a practice involving them introverting and connecting with a sense of union with every other creature on the planet and on the planet itself. And they've tried to articulate that, but when you articulate a personal experience to people who haven't had that experience, their chattering minds get involved. And so that's where the miscreants come. And there are always miscreants who are happy to leverage the adulation that mystics seem to get for political purposes. So we have a precision that we would apply, and that is, you use the term religion. We would say that when you say religion, you're actually discussing theocracies. Our perspective is that theocracies are merely dictatorships with an invisible, immortal dictator who cannot be deposed. And they're the ideal tool for anybody wanting to exert political power. So we would separate.
We've had a bit of that so far.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and it's actually very relevant because at this time we have two theocracies from our perspective battling for primacy of power on the earth and indeed in this country. It's wonderful here. We have a tradition of democracy, which is battling with theocracy as well. The House of Commons was established as a challenge to the Church of England.
And autocracy, throw that one in.
Yeah, absolutely. But the notion of the mystical experience has primacy with us. Once a person's had a mystical experience, then you recognize that actually that mystical experience represents itself in a gender-free environment. Our tradition, 5,000 years, we would say a lot more than 5,000 years, we have never had a theocracy in India. And that's because of the multiplicity, the pure democracy of how you wish to engage
like the caste
with
system.
divinity. Well, caste is a Portuguese word, and like all
Did you see the caste bomb being deployed? Right? Absolutely nothing to do with the subject that we're talking about. We're talking about social structures, theocracies, democracies, history, and all sorts of things. And yet he immediately connected the fact that a Hindu is talking about Hindu history, and without him consciously being aware of what he was doing, oh, but you have the caste system. This is the caste bomb. Okay. Now, the speech that I showed you of Lord Harries in Parliament is another manifestation of the caste bomb. It is the means whereby you can take this trope, put it into words, and toss it in the direction of any Hindu. And unless that Hindu is aware of his own history and his own Dharmic philosophy, that Hindu is diminished. This is nothing to do with education. This is nothing to do with interfaith. This is purely to do with raw political power. It's a power play. And this is one aspect which we as Hindus have never really understood. We have always thought that, hang on, if we do teach people that we have had Adi Shankaracharya ji, who was bold enough to say, Name Mrityu Shankha, Name Jati Bheda. We have had so many people who have always said that Jati discrimination is a terrible thing, that humans being discriminatory against other innocent human beings is a terrible thing. We've always felt that if we can play our cards and display our credentials, decent people will accept what we're saying. But they haven't done so. And have you noticed how even to this day, despite all of our efforts, over in Santa Clara, a group of legislators in California are sitting around a table looking at the Hindu community. And they've received allegations that Hindus are doing that same terrible thing. They're being caste supremacist against other Hindus in America. Again, look at the irony of it. We have people who are from a Euro-Christian tradition who forcibly occupied the United States, what they call the United States, on the basis of some of the most horrific pogroms, some of the most genocidal campaigns, forcibly occupying, and yet they're sitting wanting to pass judgment on a group of indigenous people from another civilization, which was also occupied and subjected to genocide. And yet the conversation is about protecting the poor native from their own selves. And yet the irony escapes them. We need to be able to talk this language now. We need to recognize that there is a power play underway here. We need to understand the mechanics of how it works. And we need to put forward solutions to challenge this. Now, I would ask everybody to, there is a lot of history in the book which supports everything that I have said. And I'm not going to take this valuable opportunity for engagement to go through much of the history, but I would like to just, for a few moments, touch on strategy. You know, we talk in this day and age of the world being a global village. Okay, now I'm very fortunate in that I was born in a tiny village. We only had 12 houses in that village, and my early years were spent in Punjab in Bharat. And I still have very close ties and roots with the village. And I know that in a village, one's neighbors are one's most valuable allies, and that you have to have wonderful relationships with your neighbors. Now, if we look at our global village today, I'm sitting here in London having a conversation, and there are many people from all over the world. The world is truly a global village. But what a global village cannot afford is toxic neighbors. And in the same way that a village has to find means to deal with its toxic neighbors, we as a house, as a Bharatiya family, have to find a way to protect our house from toxic neighbors. It's quite remarkable. We're approaching, August is a time when we traditionally celebrate independence, the independence of India. And yet, as an example of how deeply colonized our thinking was and how conditioned we were, just think of the word independence, okay? It sends out the message that India was dependent upon England up until 1947, and then it had matured enough to be able to stand up on its own 2 feet and venture into the world. And yet we know that Britain took $45 trillion worth of wealth out of its dependency, right? That during the period of its dominionship, that we had almost 80 million documented deaths across that nation. So it would strike me that, in fact, the nation that was dependent was Britain, and the nation that was providing the nourishment and sustenance for Britain was Bharat. And so, if anything, Britain is the nation which became independent in 47, and Bharat is the nation which started its journey towards decolonization and recovery and healing, because it's the most horrific trauma that human beings have yet to declare and discuss. And so we shouldn't be calling it Independence Day, because Bharat did not become independent. And yet we have never interrogated that word and that concept and that idea and its use. So part of what we have to do is to be able to look at every word that we use and the context in which we use it and modify it. And if given the opportunity, preferably use our own vocabulary. We should not be talking in the language of faith and interfaith. We should be talking in the language of dharm, adharm, vidya, avidya, satya, and asat. These are much better words and ideas with which to navigate ideologies and theories and paramparas and everything else. We have a much more skillful set of understandings, ideas, and vocabulary that we can use. So we should be using those words as opposed to words and ideas which come from an alien and, tragically, pretty uncivilized, barbaric civilization. So we need to start looking at all of these concepts from our own Indic lens. What we will find that Indology is the science or the language or the art whereby a vocabulary and a history was created to conceal what was really done by an occupying force, by an occupying nation. And if we are going to be confining ourselves to their ideas and their concepts, then we will struggle. Whereas if we look at it with our own dharmic lens and perhaps we should create a science or a body of knowledge called Anglology, the study of the Anglos and what they did when they came out of Europe and discovered boats and how to row. And that would be a field worthy of study. And if we did that from a dharmic set of languages and vocabularies, we would come up with a completely different history of humanity. This is the job that's in front of us. Now, the first thing I said was in this global village, we have to learn to protect our own house and our own family. And the first requirement of that is to eject everybody who is afflicted with a conflict of interest from this conversation. I don't talk to white people about problems in Bharat. I want to talk to them about white supremacy. I want to talk to them about their history. And let's see what we can do to help the world recover from their history. In the past, anybody wanted to talk to us about caste, we would sit there and talk and listen to them, even though their history has been concealed and their motives are missionary or conversionary. Why do we engage in conversations with people who have conflicts of interest? We should clearly eject anybody who has a conflict of interest and talk to them about their history. If somebody wants to talk to me about Manusmriti and they're from a Christian background, I want to talk to them about the Theodosian Code. And I would share with everybody, please go and have a look at the Code of Theodosius or read the Old Testament. And let's have a conversation about things that they would prefer to keep hidden so they can maintain the moral high ground. This is again part of protecting our boundaries, not just our physical boundaries, but our intellectual, academic, and emotional boundaries. We need to police those boundaries. The second thing is language is really important. If you want to diffuse the caste bomb, I insist on people using the word class instead of the word caste, because caste is merely Portuguese for class. In English, why should I use a Portuguese word when I have a perfectly acceptable word, class? We spoke with the legislators and I did submit to them. I said, if you want to introduce this legislation, introduce the word class into equality legislation. And let's stop discrimination on the basis of class. It's an English word, it's English law. It means exactly the same as caste does from the Portuguese sense. They refuse to do it because in England, we have a class system. We have a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous royal family. I can never be king of this country. This is discrimination. This is caste discrimination enshrined into the nation's constitutions. And yet this is the civilization which would want to save Hindus from caste discrimination. So I would say, if anybody wants to talk to me about those issues, let's use the word class. If you want to put it into law, put class into law. Not only will it give the protections to Dalits and everybody else, but it was also give innocent Brahmin groups, innocent Kshatriya groups, innocent Jat groups, all of those groups would automatically be made equal because as classes, they could not be discriminated against. In fact, it would be a much superior solution to have class than have caste. So the important idea is instead of people wanting to use the word caste, they should use the word class. Now, they don't like this because they know that the only reason they're using the word caste is because ideologically it's attached to Hindus. Now, isn't that in itself an act of discrimination? Right? This is the impact of a colonialist trope, a hate trope. If you want to think of it in a slightly different manner, the word caste is pre-packaged Hinduphobia or odium or hatred of Hindus in one word. If you want to incite contempt of a Hindu, you just leverage the word caste. That's it. That's all you need to do. It is a hate trope. I've emphasized to people that from my perspective, it is no less offensive than the N-word is to a person of African descent. That is a hate trope, and so is the word caste. It's a hate trope, and we should not permit it. Those are probably the best ways in which to diffuse the caste bomb. If we can create a safe space for the Hindu community to have these conversations, what will happen is we will find that it's our own brothers and sisters who nowadays identify as Dalits and who were separated as a specific objective of divide and rule by British Christianists. Once they know their history and we know our history, we will see that somebody from outside of the family came to divide us, and they leveraged really old-fashioned divide and rule, and we haven't yet been able to heal the wound that they inflicted on our family. That time will come, and when that time comes, it will be seen by every Hindu that in the same way that it's wrong for a person of what they call a low caste family to be discriminated against, it's equally wrong for a child born into a family who were traditionally teachers to be discriminated against. It's wrong for one person to have to acquire 95% marks in order to pass an exam. It's assuming that that child is guilty of crimes that were alleged allegations against their ancestors. What sort of law is that? But this is the nature of the legal mind that is imposing this type of legislation upon us. One other thing that I wanted to bring into common conversation was the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. It's a remarkable piece of legislation. I think it should be compulsory teaching for every Hindu and indeed every Christian to understand the mindset that was prevalent when the caste concept was created. This 1871 Criminal Tribes Act, it asserted that there are Hindus who are born criminals. They will always be criminals, they will die criminals, their children will be criminals. And this was an act that was passed in the same Houses of Parliament that 200 years later wanted to pass anti-Hindu caste legislation against us. It was assuming that Hindus are born discriminatory, and the same thing was done in 1871 when they assumed that Hindus were born criminals. And it's the same ideology which has been telling humanity that they are born sinners, and that they need interference and they need course correction by this incredible institution called the Church of England. They are responsible for the suffering that Hindus have suffered. And in my book and in my conversations, I've emphasized that they have this blood on their hands. And the sooner they come to terms with it, the sooner the whole of humanity can put this sorry incident and this unbelievably unpleasant period of occupation, we can relegate it to the dustbin of history where it belongs. On that note, I will give my voice an opportunity to rest. I have been quite open and politically potentially incorrect. If I have offended anybody, we're all consenting adults, and none of us are so fragile that we would suffer pain and angst on the basis of words. We are taught that words are the domain of free thinkers, and that is a part of the Sanatani tradition. If I've said anything which people feel was inappropriate, I'm completely open to being challenged courageously and vocally, and hopefully only good will come of it. So I have started the Samudra Manthan on this subject. I will now invite everybody else to participate and take control of the Manthan, and let's see whether we can perhaps move this conversation forward. Thank you very much for listening and for the opportunity of the platform. And so Ramji and Ankurji, I will hand the control of this particular session back to you.
I'll just start with the first question. It's by Utkarsh. I think it's more of a comment than a question. He says, why do you not make use of the scholarly works by the likes of S.N. Balagangadhar or Yakub de Ruver?
Wonderful question.
Yeah.
And I can address that very quickly.
Okay,
I'm
sure.
aware of Balagangadharji's work, and I'm aware of Jacob's work. I have met with them. And in fact, when we were challenging this issue here in the United Kingdom, they were kind enough to come over and participate in conferences that we were all attending. I'm aware of their work. Now, here is something that I'd like everyone to perhaps consider. Anybody who studies the history, anybody who studies unbiased commentary on this subject will discover quite simply some of the facts that I've put forward. But the difficulty is that much of the work which is of academic level, it never gets into common parlance. It never gets onto the desktop. If you can pay £70 for a book on caste, which will contain all of the history and everything else, and much wonderful work. But who is going to pay £70 for a hardback which will sit on a shelf and not be read? When I wrote the book, my ambition was to write something which was no more than 100 pages. And in that 100 pages, I wanted to communicate not just the history, not just the essence, but also the strategy on how to engage. Rather than a conversation on pure caste and how to deal with it, I wanted to have a conversation on applied strategy of caste. How do we deal with this in the day-to-day world? And so the reason I wrote the book was to, one, bring this subject into everybody's conversation and to make it totally accessible, but also to put into their strategy. Now, as you've seen, the conversation we've had this morning, I'm sharing with you, I'm telling you an account of actual engagements that we had. We dealt with this issue, we worked out a strategy, we understood its political dimension. We understood its academic dimension. We understood its religious dimension. We understood its colonial dimension. And for each of those 4 dimensions, we worked out a sub-strategy which would allow us to try and preserve our community's integrity, dignity, and to restore some of our damaged reputation. So there is wonderful work that's out there. Much of it I refer to in the back, and there are several texts I refer to in the back which are not so easily available. And I was blessed to spend a bit of time in Kolkata in my professional career many years ago. And I remember walking around the back streets where they have the most amazing bookstores in Kolkata, New College Road and places like that. And where you can find somebody who's 3rd generation bookkeeper, and he carries in his head a complete library. I wandered around in these bookstores, and I would often say I'd like to have a text written by an English person in colonial times about this particular subject. And I remember a friend, a gentleman called Abhishek Bhattacharya ji, who ran a book, 3rd generation bookkeeper, and he knew which books I wanted. And at that time, decades ago, I acquired many books about the history of Bharat, which are not so easily available, and they're referenced in the materials. So yes, there is a lot out there. But what I wanted to create was a workbook that people could use to diffuse the caste bomb, not just something that would be appealing to academics. So lots of studies are out there. Hopefully people can find something practical in the book that I've written.
Thank you, Satish. I think it answers the question very well. The second question is also by Utkarsh. He says, Ambedkar implied in his Annihilation of Caste that the criminal castes are due to the Shastras or the Manusmriti. I allege, that means the questioner, that he committed this error willfully and he must have known about the Criminal Tribes Act. Do you have any comments on that?
So there are two dimensions to Utkarshi's wonderful question. One is the frame of mind and the state of knowledge and understanding of Ambedkarji. And I can't, unless I have the evidence which would prove that it was an act of malice, then I couldn't say that it was an act of malice. I can't support the assertion that he committed this error willfully. But one thing I do know is that he was heavily colonized as an individual. His exposure to British value systems and the British jurisprudence, the concepts that are enshrined in British law, are visible in the constitution and the processes. In fact, they're visible in his writings. He was, if you have a notion of two lenses, his vision of Bharat was closer to the British lens than it was to the Sanatani Dharmic lens. I don't doubt for a moment that his motivation was to restore equality and dignity to all Hindus. Absolutely, that was definitely his motive. But I do see in his writing significant omissions. For example, in your question, Utkarshi, and indeed in Ambedkar's writings, he uses caste as though the concept of caste appears as an equivalent word in Sanskrit and Shastric literature. It doesn't. We have no word which implies the existence of a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous social unit. There is no word for that whatsoever. Varna is referred to, but Varna is nothing to do with caste. Varna is, and I've explained this, that the root var indicates one of many. It's a choice, it's a variety, like a rainbow. It's a collection of colors. And in English, the word variety uses the same root, variation, var. We have varmala when a princess would indicate her choice of a groom by putting a garland around that individual, selecting one from many. We have the language itself, varanmala, which is a string of vibrations. We're choosing a sound from many. So Varna is nothing to do with caste, and it's easily established that that's the case. And any person who asserts that the two are interchangeable has still got some element of decolonizing their own understanding of their own vocabulary yet to do. So great question, but in no Shastra and not even Manusmriti, the much maligned and incorrectly maligned Manusmriti, it doesn't appear. Ambedkarji did not realize this. This is a fundamental indication of how shaky his foundational understanding of Shastra actually was.
Thank you, Satish ji. It was, I think, a point very well explained that we don't have any concept of caste in the Shastras and how people have confused Varna with caste. And, it's very interesting and important to remember this point. The next two questions are similar, so I'll club them into one question. Rajesh is asking, how can we come out of this situation? And the similar question is being asked by D. Mohanty, who says, how to combat against Desi deracinated Hindus who are playing, let's say, the Ambedkar card and only emphasize on examples from casteism in India without taking into account the other side, where there were a lot of examples of how many. What are some of the books? I think the books you already recommended, so maybe you can just take the part that is about what is the future roadmap.
A wonderful question. Again, it's concerned with the utilitarian understanding, the utilitarian applicability of what this book is intended to do. Firstly, I think we have to recognize that even these deracinated Desi Hindus, as he's referring to them, they are our family. Okay, we have to understand that they are victims of the same pernicious colonialist scheme. It was created to create a rift between us and them. That's the purpose of it. And once we recognize that and we stop looking at them as though they are a different group, if we fall into the same trap of dealing with them as the other, then those who created this scheme, they win, they laugh. We have to recognize that ये हमारे भाई बहन है, ये हमारा घर है, ये अपना परिवार है, and that we have all been on the receiving end of this vicious assault. So first step is we have to be open to recognizing suffering. Now in the book, I also cover how the Dalit community was actually created by the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. Some of the most resistant groups, the people who were challenging the established power base of the church and of the British colonialists, they were the ones who were included automatically with just a tick of a British administrator's pen. Their whole lineage and community was deemed to be a criminal tribe. And they were deprived the opportunity of earning an income. They were deprived dignity. They were confined into concentration camps. 13 million plus were recorded in 1947, just over 60 years ago when the British left. This is where the downtrodden community came from. The hardships that they were subjected to at the hands of the British, unbelievably horrific. And then the British told them that actually their status wasn't due to the British, it was due to the high castes. So we have to recognize and educate everybody that this is the history behind this rift. Once we have done that, then we can address the trauma that was installed into our community. Then we can actually look at some of the most respectable lineages. In the book, I refer to one group they ran caravans, they were merchants, they took goods from one city to another city, and they were held in the highest of trust because a merchant would manufacture his goods and give it to them. They were responsible for taking the goods to the other city, for collecting the money and bringing the money back. Now, can you imagine the amount of trust that is placed in the hands of somebody of that responsibility? They had the highest trust. What the British wanted to do was to tax the movement of goods. And so those people who ancestrally had been operating these caravans throughout the country, they were all badged as being criminal tribes, just a tick of a pen. And it deprived them of their livelihood. They were confined into concentration camps and were subjected to the most horrific indignities. When you start to realize that this is the reality behind this caste issue, then we have an opportunity of, with courtesy, with respect, with affection, of being open to all parts of the community. And then we can have conversations. Deracination is a difficult process. It has to be approached in the same way in which one approaches a person who is suffering a deep emotional trauma. We have a traumatized community, and we have to be open and courageous to approach those, even those who distance us. One of the things associated with this, I've always said to people, if you think I'm a high caste, because this is what they do, they say, oh, Satish, you're a Brahmin. Of course you would say this, not recognizing the prejudice that is involved in making that statement, the allegation that just because I have a surname of a particular type, that disqualifies me from being a decent member of humanity. It doesn't occur to them that they're actually doing exactly what they accuse everybody else of doing. But when somebody says you're a high caste, I say, okay, what's the metric? When you put something as high and you put something as low, what is the unit of measurement that you are using to say that I am high and that you are low? And nobody has any unit of measurement which is applicable to all use of that metric. There's only one, and that metric is threat level to missionaries and Christianists. The Brahmins, the Christian evangelical missionaries accepted that the Brahmins were the highest threat to them, and that the uneducated, the tribals, were the lowest threat to them. And so if you look at the scale of high to low caste, the only metric that's applicable is threat level to the missionary, evangelical, colonial objective. And I hope that was challenging enough.
Sure. The next question is from Shanti. She asks, what will be your suggestion to move Hindus from gossip to dinner table discussion? I'm not sure what this means, although. Is it possible to quantify the mental trauma caste discussion inflicts on a child growing up?
Okay. Now, being a Hindu, firstly, Shantiji, wonderful question, very relevant, and it's actually a question where I'm very well qualified to contribute a perspective and opinion, because we have done this. We did this with our children in the United Kingdom. We are still doing it with our children in the United Kingdom. And the answer that I would share with you has two parts to it. Firstly, when I wrote this book, it was consciously my intention not to write a book which is just a collation of facts. It was to write a book which was emotionally challenging. It was to write a book which required a person to not only use their head, but also engage their heart. And the only benefit that I thought would be valuable would be if it could actually precipitate a transformation. What I wanted is a person who had read the book at the other end would scream out loud at the injustice that was done, that the person would be so deeply motivated to set this right that they had to do something, that they would have to talk to somebody about it. And so the book was written with that intention. One of my friends, he read it and he came back to me and he said, Satishji, this is not just a normal book. This is an Agni Shastra. He said, there is fire in this book. Having read it, I wanted to do something about it. And so that was a distinct intention. I wanted this book to carry within it its own momentum to travel, its own dynamism and its own energy to move from person to person. And so the first thing I would suggest, and I find it culturally difficult to blow my own trumpet, right, and peddle this book, because we don't like to sell things, you know, that's not a Hindu thing to do. But I would recommend that anybody and everybody reads the book. You can, I think if you're a member of Amazon Online or something, Amazon Prime or something like that, it's free to read. And it's priced at a negligible price because we want people to read it. And so if you were to read it, that's the first step. It is intended to be transformative and troubling. Secondly, is that we can't be passive with this issue. The opposition who do not want to see Hindus recover and diffuse this caste bomb, they're very active, they're very dynamic. And many of them are unwitting sepoys. They are unwitting agents. In espionage terms, there's a wonderful term, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but spies apparently recruit what are called youthful idiots. They're people who are capable of being conditioned, motivated, wound up, pointed, and then launched. And we have so many who are working on this caste issue who have no idea that they're actually part of a much larger scheme. And they're very active. So we have to be active. We have to actually say, we're going to talk about caste. In the past, our Hindu community has always shied away and said, no, caste, we don't want to talk about it because we've carried this subliminal guilt. Once that subliminal guilt is gone, then we should have the courage to say, we want to talk about caste to every Hindu person we come across. We want to hold little conferences. We want to hold little conversations in the family. You know, we want to engage with Christians, and let's have a conversation about the Christian contribution to the caste issue. The information is all in there, but we need to be active. We need to be dynamic in doing this. And so I would quote what Krishnaji said to Arjun, even after 18 chapters, and Krishnaji said, what shall I do next? He said, kuch to karo, you know, yatha ichchasi tatha kuru, right? Go ahead and do something, and it will start to gather its own momentum. But we need to be doing. Knowing is not enough. And what Ramji and Ankuji and Indus University they are doing something. They've encountered the understanding, they have recognized its importance, and they have engaged and created an opportunity for us to have this conversation. And I would recommend wholeheartedly that each and every one of you do this, because the opposition is wanting to not lose control of a 250-year investment in a hate brand that has been carefully nurtured, cultivated, and is of immense value to them. And the cover of the book, I have deliberately designed it for everybody to be crystal clear about what the motive is. The motive is to deconstruct Bharat. Imagine a powerful Bharat which is reconnected with the trajectory of its own civilization. We were on a civilizational trajectory until barbarians invaded, and that civilizational trajectory, if we reconnect with it, imagine what Bharat will be. But a part of that reconnection is then revisiting our own history. And that will then mean that we acquire the ability, the energy, and we feel the urgency in telling people of what was done to us by those people who came. And they don't want that. Europe, I often have conversations with my European friends, and I often say to them that Europe is nothing other than a colonial cartel. a bunch of white guys with terrible social skills traipsed around the world wreaking havoc. When they were thrown out from these other countries, they all came back and created a cartel, a Euro-Christian white cartel. That's what Europe is to this day. And their power is based upon the colonies not knowing what was done to them. They do not want to see this trope disbanded and deconstructed. They have an investment, and it's in their interest for it not to be deconstructed. And yet it will. But for our own survival, for our own existence, and for reconnecting with our civilizational trajectory, which is an amazing civilizational trajectory, reconnecting with it is absolutely critical, and we have to reconnect with it, so we have to act. Now, I would go even further. As a civilization, we are the only civilization who maximized human enjoyment, anand, with minimum consumption. This is the heart of our civilizational ethos. How can you absolutely escalate and accelerate the experience of anand as a human being, but leave the lightest, smallest footprint on the planet? This is our civilizational trajectory. And if you ask me, the rest of humanity is desperately in need, both of anand, but also diminishing its civilizational footprint and its consumption footprint. So this is really important work. It's work for every Hindu to do, and it's work which carries its own reward. As you can see, I'm fairly happy about this work, right? There is a great sense of anand in being able to undo the harm and to lift some degree of the burden that our community is carrying. It nourishes and it nurtures, and it will reconnect every one of our children who understands how our history was, shall we say, contorted and twisted and then recycled and fed to us, and recovers from it. This will give us spine. This understanding will give us confidence. You know, Hanumanji wasn't able to do anything until people told him what his history was. And we are Hanumanji who's forgotten who we are. And this is part of us relearning this. So please, it doesn't matter what you do something. Read the book, talk about it. If there is somebody who you want to really upset, send them a copy of my book. If they are happy with their little identity and interfaith and, you know, Sarva Dharma Sambhava and all of that stuff, send them a copy of my book. It will be an entertaining act.
Thank you, Satish ji. I'll let the next question come from Shakti Kumar, and then I'll go to Gauri Shankar, who is raising his hand for quite some time now. So the question from Shakti is, have you ever had conversation with Dalit groups or Dalit leaders? How well do they subscribe to your ideas?
I have had conversations. In fact, when this issue arose here in the United Kingdom, the first thing I did was to approach those groups that British social profiling would say were Dalits or were low caste. We approached them and we had wonderful conversations. And in fact, when they understood what I was presenting to them, it made them even closer to us. Now, there is another dimension to this. And one of a dear friend of mine, a leader of the so-called Dalit community, he said, Satish, we don't want to be called Dalits. He said, why should we be called Dalits? We're in this country. My children are financiers in the City of London, right? My daughter is a lawyer with a prominent law firm. We're not Dalits. Why on earth should I plague them with this social categorization? So they have already embarked upon the healing process and regained their own self-dignity and their own confidence. And when I shared with them the history of what was done, that brought them even closer to us. And so, yes, we have engaged with those groups. The only ones who will not engage with us and who prefer to hurl objections from a distance are those who have a vested political interest. Now, there are some Dalit, shall we say Dalit or scholars of Dalit history in the United Kingdom who have built a career on the foundational precept that caste is a fundamental part of Sanatan Dharma. And the moment they recognize the validity of the facts and the history that we're presenting to them and the true meaning of the scriptures, their careers disappear. Their life has been a lie. When I share with them a simple idea, for example, I'll share it with everybody. If you look at a Janam Patrika, Varna is stated in a Janam Patrika. And so it's perfectly possible, and it is in the case of my own family and myself, right? I'm an anachronism. I don't fit into this caste ideology because I have a Sharma as a surname, but my Janam Patrika says that my Varna is Kshatriya. And so if that isn't evidence that Kshatriya people can be born in a Brahmin sort of family and a kul, then what more evidence do you need? The notion that some attributes are, this categorization is hereditary is false. And we have said it time and time again, that this is not how it works. Varna is not caste. And the moment people start to accept that, then those who are politically invested, they're threatened. Those whose academic credibility is on such shaky foundations, they are threatened. And they won't engage with us. And I can understand why. So we treat them with courtesy and respect and look forward to the opportunity when they have no choice but to recognize that a part of learning is to discard what we thought we knew and to take on something which is a better understanding of the way things are. Learning is all about discarding tropes. Learning is all about stepping from one truth to a better understanding of truth. And we have built our understanding of this issue on Satya. So yes, absolutely. The formerly badged, labeled Dalit community are as keen to shed this demeaning label, this undermining label. The psychology of how a caste-based ideology destroys everybody at every supposed level is well understood. If you introduced any of these concepts of discrimination and divide and rule, all subgroups fall in their attainment and their growth. And so we have to throw the whole lot out. There is no compromise on this issue. We have to return it to those who were so generous in giving it to us.
Thank you, Satish. It was very well explained that, and very pleasing to know that the Dalits that you spoke to are willing to come out of this whole categorization.
I can't see them as Dalits.
Yeah.
I don't see them as Dalits. I see them as Hindus, and I know that they're victims of some of the most horrific social engineering. I have one request. Utkarshji has said he's put a previous version of this text on archive. I'd be grateful if you could take it down for one reason and one reason alone, and that is that was an earlier version and it contained omissions. And we have put additional information which makes this read significantly more complete. I've had so many people who have asked me questions on the earlier version, which is what we submitted to Parliament, and those questions are answered in this particular book. So it'd be very useful to, if you could remove that, I'd be really grateful. It takes up a lot of my time in answering questions on issues that are no longer current.
Sure, thank you. I will now request Gauri Shankar Krishna.
Thank you, Utkarshi. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah. So
I was just saying that Utkarshi has very kindly sent a message saying, okay, we'll take it down. So I just wanted to express my thanks to him. You were saying,
yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, nice.
Okay.
That's wonderful. Very quick to respond. Okay, Gauri Shankar, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi Satish and Utkarsh, how are you?
Pranam ji, namaskar ji, a pleasure to connect with you.
Yeah, so actually, according to my observation and my research is concerned, the Dalits are the people who are subjected to monitor Brahmins. I think this will be a very strange word for you. So the thing is, if you of the Rakshasas, majority of the Rakshasas are Brahmins. For example, Hiranyaksh, Hiranyakashyap, Ravan, Kumbhakarna, and Lavanasur, Mahishasur. So many Rakshasas are Brahmins. And those people who killed those Rakshasas are nothing but Dalits. For example, if you take Mahishasur, the person who killed Mahishasur is Gauri. Gauri means Giriputri. Giriputri is scheduled tribe. And if you take Hiranyakashyapa, that Narasimha Swami, he belongs to scheduled tribe, because in Andhra Pradesh that Vajrastamba is
Gauri
presented.
Shankarji,
Uh,
Gauri
yeah,
Shankarji, if I can just intervene for one moment, you are using so many terms
uh,
with what I feel to be a lack of adequate precision. The only
yeah.
way we can navigate this is by
No,
going
no.
step by
Yeah, yeah,
step and looking at each and every item.
yeah,
But I would
yeah.
say one
My
thing.
main thing is, I'm about to conclude my question. The thing is,
Mhm.
so if you, and another thing is, if you enlist the Gotras of Brahmins, 95% of Gotras are belong to the people who achieved Brahmatva. Not as a, not, they are not by birth as Brahmins. They achieved themselves to the level of Brahmatva. But during the course of time, this procedure is getting is vanished. Getting Brahmatva, who in whatever that one that your birth may be, every person is having right to achieve the Brahmatva. This concept is not at all being practiced in nowadays. So our
We
main duty
have
is to
Sorry,
bring out that thing.
Okay, we have a lot of work to do, but let me just confirm a couple of things that you have said. I often say to people that if you have the good fortune to be born in a family which has preserved Vidya, Brahm Vidya, Yog Vidya, any Vidya, you are very, very fortunate. And you have a greater responsibility to do sadhana. Because if you are born in a family where sadhana has been the lineage and it's been the dynamic, and you don't do sadhana, you have a greater probability of becoming a Ravan. Right? The more contributions people give to you, the more skills you have, the more inclination you have towards intellect and all of those things, you have to do more sadhana. It's important for anybody who is engaged in these activities to be engaged equally with sadhana. And that is the only thing that prevents somebody from becoming a Ravan when they have the benefits of growing up amongst families who preserve Vidya. One other thing I think is really important to understand is that Brahmins, we have, I'm going to draw a diagram about this. We have paramparas, we have kul, and kul actually were mechanisms for preserving social knowledge capital. And if you are born into a kul, you have access to that. And if you are born into a kul and your natural inclination is studying, then equally in this day and age, it's important that you do sadhana. I know many people who are born with the benefits of being in a kul, but they don't adhere to the precepts. They don't follow the strict requirements. They don't engage in sadhana. And so they have they should have no natural expectation of being treated as though they are qualified to receive respect and courtesy as being intellectuals. It really is very, very straightforward. We had such a simple and precise and completely natural way of doing things, of uniting a person with their aptitude, with their lineage, with their parampara, with their Gurukul tradition. And it's all been set against each other. It's all been deconstructed and created as a very unpleasant manifestation. And we're trying to put it back together again. But I would close on just emphasizing nothing that our Shastra indicate as being recommended is unnatural or is in any way, shape, or form designed to diminish another human being by virtue of some name or some label or anything like that. Our ancients were a lot wiser than to fall into such a simple elementary trap.